This is the Into the Light podcast, where we interview authors, counselors, and speakers on biblical sexuality and the Christian life. This is a resource of Into the Light Ministries. If you have questions about biblical sexuality, whether as a parent, teen, struggler, counselor, or pastor, we have resources for you. Visit intothelightministries.ca. Enjoy the episode. Julie, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. Super excited to have you share with me and to have this interview. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, what you've written, your career? Just tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a counselor, licensed professional counselor, also certified as a play therapist supervisor, but love doing biblical counseling with families, with individuals, marriage and children and teens. Been doing it about 25 years. I've taught at a couple of local seminaries for their counseling courses and written several books and many books. I am a wife, mom of 5, been a foster parent for close to 20 years, so busy life.
Yeah, it's super encouraging. I would love to talk a lot about some of the stuff that's more included in your most recent book, Safeguards, which just want to encourage everybody listening to go read. I found it such a helpful, short, practical book on thinking about safety in parenting. What does it mean as a Christian family to think through raising children in an unsafe world, but raising them safely? So just to get us started, can you talk a little bit about what the ultimate goal of parenting is and why protection alone is too short-sighted a goal for parents?
Yeah, especially in our world where we're much more aware of abuse and danger, you hear parents who are very driven to keep their kids safe. And there's a little bit of a concern there that it's a good goal, but it's not the most important goal. I always say the most important goal as a parent is to raise my children to know God and His ways. And then safety is a fruit of that goal. But if we make safety our ultimate goal, it often leads us to unwise choices. Where if my ultimate goal is to teach children to know God and His ways, then they're going to be discerning and wise, and they're going to be equipped to be able to navigate the world around us.
Yeah, totally. Do you see Scripture giving us clear categories or passages that you would lead parents to kind of undergird what you just said?
Yeah, there's many. So one of my favorite verses is Hebrews 5:14, and this is probably more of an equipping verse in my mind, but it talks about solid food being for the mature, those who practice their powers of discernment that come from constant practice to distinguish good from evil. And if you break that down, you think about it, what do we want? We want children that are wise and discerning, that can navigate the world. Our job's not to just protect them, because then they enter out into the world and they don't know how to navigate it. We're called to equip them to be able to navigate the world. So how do you do that? You raise them to be discerning and wise. How do they become discerning and wise? Well, constant practice, which means role play, having conversations with them. Deuteronomy 6 says whether you're walking along the way or whether you rise or you eat or you're in the family van, are you always talking about life and giving them a solid worldview? And then what are you constantly practicing? You're practicing distinguishing right from wrong, good from bad, wise from unwise.
Yeah, that's so good. I think in a culture and a world that we live in, especially with the effects of being able to see everything like on a stage within seconds, what's going on in the world and with fast news, I think parents can really struggle to not have a lot of fear and anxiety for their children. Can you talk to me about why worry and fear, denial are not really safety skills in and of themselves?
Yeah, well, Scripture talks a lot about worry, right? And not to fear, not to worry. Worry is very future-oriented. It projects all of your concerns into the future, where genuine perception and discernment pays attention to what's happening now. And so if I'm constantly worrying, I'm not able to really focus on what's happening in the moment. Instead, it's all my potential fears and dangers. And parents that worry raise children that worry. And in many ways, we handicap our children by doing that because they don't learn to genuinely be able to perceive danger when it exists. Rather, the whole world seems dangerous to them at all times. So Scripture speaks consistently, repeatedly about not fearing and not worrying, and who can add a single hour by your life. As a matter of fact, we rob ourselves of many enjoyment and pleasures. But you'll also see in Proverbs it talks about the wise, the prudent see danger, and what do? They run from it. They don't just run into it, or they don't just watch it. We're proactively called to avoid the evils of this world, the danger as well. So what do you need to do that? You need genuine perception. You need wisdom. You need discernment. You need to be able to walk among a broken, fallen world and see danger where it really exists, and not worry either, because ultimately our lives are in the hands of the Lord.
Yeah, that's good. I can hear, maybe it's moms or dads listening to this, like, all right, like, I know I need to trust the Lord in the safety of my children. I know that, despite being in this crazy world, we can have courage and hope. We can step boldly into that in our parenting. But I don't feel that right now. How would you counsel someone like that to take hold of trusting the Lord in this?
Yeah, well, I guess we can have many different fears. So the one is I feel ill-equipped and inadequate. And that's where I'd say there are great resources out there. There are books. There are people that can help you. Others maybe live in a little bit more denial, where they're like, oh, it's not that bad, or it's never happened in my family, never happened in my circles, never happened in my church. And denial robs you of the ability to see danger as well. And it means that we don't want to talk to our kids about it. So depending on what a parent's struggling with, really depends on what their need is. But we want our kids to be aware that we know that they're facing hard things around them. And so having parents really check in with their kids, talk to them, engage them, ask them really good questions about what their friends are talking about and what they're doing. And then looking for good resources out there. The wonderful thing about the modern age we live in is that we are coming out with some really good resources to help parents navigate it.
Yeah, totally. I'd love to focus in now on a very difficult topic, scary topic for people to think through. But I want to talk about sexual abuse. I think this is an area of parenting and safety that exists, this happens, but it's not going to be, not my family, not
Right.
my kid.
Right.
So maybe just start out by addressing that person. I think that subtle belief that I know that happens, but that's not going to happen to my daughter or my son.
Right. Or if it did, I would know the danger is coming. And that's where I think we're naive to the ways of deception and evil in our world. Scripture talks a lot about the deceiver winks with his eyes, and he preys upon the vulnerable and the innocent, but yet we all think somehow we would recognize that. And the reality is we don't. And that's not necessarily bad. I don't want to go around thinking everybody who talks to my children are going to abuse them, but I also want to be very savvy to the fact that my job until my kids are old enough is to protect them, and I'm also called to equip them to protect themselves. So if I avoid thinking that abuse is a possibility, then I don't prepare my children to know how to handle it should somebody try grooming them or approaching them. And as a counselor who has worked in a counseling center with Christians for 25 years, I will tell you it happens way too often. It happens in the churches, it happens in Christian families, and happens even among siblings, because our culture is just surrounded by depravity and pornography and all kinds of things that's corrupting our children, which means they're influencing each other as well. So you have the world, the flesh, and the devil that we're constantly combating at. And having our children grow up in that means we've got to be proactive, not reactive.
Yeah. So along that lines, how can parents, what should parents be looking for and ready to recognize if there are signs that this is happening, or even things to know to look for that where someone might be grooming their child?
Yeah. Well, anytime, I used to always think with my own children, anytime somebody wants access to my child, I just want to ask why. So I wasn't presuming ill upon everybody, but if somebody wanted to take my child out or somebody showed particular interest, I always just say stop and notice and say what would be the reason. And the kindest people have good motives. They want to mentor, they want to be an encouragement, they want to bless you, they want to give you a break as a parent. There could be many good reasons. But anybody who has access to my child, I want to say, I'm going to notice that. And I'm always going to be asking my child and preparing my child. So preventative stuff, being proactive, not reactive, means I'm always teaching my children what's appropriate conversations people should have with them, what's appropriate ways, what are things people should never be asking them, things that they should, things like affection or attention, or if people have my child alone by themselves, I'm always going to be paying attention. And again, it doesn't mean I'm paranoid. It just means I notice that part of grooming is it starts well-intentioned. They buy gifts, they shower attention, they give compliments. Well, think about that. A really good aunt or uncle should do that. A really good grandparent should do that. So you don't want to be suspicious, but you want to be aware. And so notice even the language to me is important, where I'm not discounting and dismissing things, nor am I overreacting or reactive. Rather, I'm always paying attention. And if I'm having those conversations with my kids, I'll more likely hear if something's off than if I'm afraid to talk about it.
What's an example of that kind of conversation you're having with your kid? Because you also don't want to, put things in their mind and have them be afraid of talking to anyone now. So how do you have those languages? Are there some example scripts that parents could even use with their kids?
Yeah. So keep pushing back on this. But even with young kids, when you're just teaching them about privacy and respect for each other. So when they go into the bathroom and they're pounding on the door to come in and you say, buddy, privacy means you never go into the bathroom when somebody's in there, and you never let anybody else come in when you're in there. Or privacy means like you should never be in a room when someone's getting dressed, nor should another grown-up or a friend or a cousin come in the room while you're getting dressed. And then I might say something like, has that ever happened to you? Or have you ever noticed anything like that? So see, I'm now offering a conversation to see if things like that have ever happened. Another common question I'll ask my kids is, hey, has anybody ever done anything to make you uncomfortable?
That's good.
Now, I love that question because I'm not saying has anybody abused you, has anybody, and they wouldn't recognize grooming signs either. So, but the language of uncomfortable is helpful because sometimes people will make my kids uncomfortable just because they're socially awkward or they're a little odd. And so if they say, yeah, so-and-so made me uncomfortable at school yesterday because he was in my personal space and he was a little autistic, and they're describing it, and I'm able to say, well, guess what, buddy, that's okay. That's just love moves towards people who are a little awkward and uncomfortable, and we're talking through when to press into that. But if you were to say, yeah, somebody made me really uncomfortable because they offered me a cigarette, or somebody made me really uncomfortable in the locker room because they kept like pulling aside the shower curtain or something like that, then I'm going, that is really important. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about what you should do. Or if a coach makes you really uncomfortable, why? And so the language of discomfort can be anything from an annoying peer to an unkind friend to something more potentially abusive. But you're teaching your kids to evaluate. You're teaching them to stop and say, what does make me uncomfortable? And then you're also building conversations with them.
Yeah, that's good. What are some other signs that parents should kind of have in the back of their mind, ready to recognize should this sort of situation show up?
Yeah, I think kids, you tend to be an expert at knowing your own child when they're acting a little off. And so I might not notice your child acting off because I don't know them as well as you do. But if they seem more disconnected or quieter, if they seem to be hiding their technology, if they seem more jumpy or aloof, So everybody's different, but you're looking for signs that your child's withdrawing. You're looking for signs that they're more fearful of things. You're asking questions about who are the people they're hanging around with, what are they doing on their devices, things like that. And then depending on the ages, probably depends on the kind of conversations you should have with them.
As kids get older, how would those conversations shift? What would a distinction be with your 6-year-old daughter versus your 18-year-old daughter?
Yeah. Well, so a principle behind it that I always say is it's far better to be proactive than reactive. I want to proactively shape the way my children think about a subject than to try to go back and debunk inaccurate views, because the world is pursuing our kids through TVs and commercials and stories and school and billboards and technology. There's worldviews that are always being impressed upon them. And so as parents, we need to proactively help shape the way they think about subjects, which means even at a very young age, talking to my children about sex and gender and sexuality. It means I'm doing it in child-appropriate ways. And most parents are afraid of that because they're afraid somehow they're stealing their child's innocence. But my argument is, well, that presumes shame about the topic to begin with. Instead of saying, if God created it, it's good. I don't have to presume shame. God made boys and girls different. God made gender. God made sex within marriage. Like, those are beautiful, created things, rightly ordered. And I'd rather my children hear that from a positive, biblical, inspiring worldview than wait until they've received the corrupted version of it by somebody else. So at a very young age, I'm talking about body parts. I'm talking about appropriate touch. I'm talking about respect and privacy. I'm talking about where babies come from. I'm answering their questions. I'm encouraging them to ask questions. So it's just this normal conversation we're having in the home. And for sure, my children have asked me awkward, uncomfortable questions before, but my job is to act like it's the most comfortable thing in the world to talk about it, even if I'm sweating on the inside. Why? Because our children need to see that no topic is too difficult for their parents to handle. So I would joke, I would say, fake it till you make it, meaning if you don't know the answer, just say, that's a really good question. Let me think about it and I'll get back to you. And then I'd walk away going, oh my goodness, I can't believe they asked me that. What in the world? And I would think about it. And the key is I should always go back and answer their question because they need to see us as a voice of influence and expertise in their life. Because if we're not, they will find it outside our home.
Yeah. To what you were saying earlier, I love the phrase, we should not be ashamed to discuss what God was not ashamed to create. I think it's so true. So thinking about now you're talking about being proactive in conversations. Are there other wisdom principles that families should think about putting in place, whether it's rules about TV at the friend's house or sleepovers? What are some of those kind of practical tools that parents can have?
Yeah, there are tons. You're bringing up tons of issues. But, so I said be proactive, not reactive. We want to proactively educate our kids before somebody else does, because then they have a grid through which to understand it and see. I often talk about that whole analogy of people who study counterfeit money or know counterfeits. They don't actually study the counterfeit, they study the real thing. And the better they get at knowing the real thing, the more they'll spot the counterfeit. Well, that's how I want to raise my kids, that the more they know God and His ways, whenever they hear any inkling of something different or corrupted in it, they'll know it right away because they're learning the skill of evaluating. They're learning discernment and wisdom. We think of discernment often as something that's a gift given to us, but Hebrews says it's a practice. It comes from constant practice of distinguishing good from evil. So it's equipping our kids regularly with conversations and letting them observe conflicts and asking them what they think about it and helping them process it, which is an ongoing conversation throughout the course of their life. The other thing I often say is talk often, talk freely, talk soon. Meaning talk often, don't let it be a one-time conversation. Talk about it all the time. Ask them questions, like months later, bring it up in the car. So talk often, talk freely. Make it a atmosphere in your home that we talk openly about things, that no topics off limits. And then I say talk soon, meaning, again, being proactive and teaching our kids, probably before you're even comfortable doing so, but you're always doing it in developmentally appropriate ways. And so as things come up, children first begin having play dates, and you're talking to them about what's appropriate and appropriate ways of playing and affection and how to have affection and what's appropriate ways of demonstrating it. And parents have to think really hard about allowing sleepovers, and that is a hot button topic for a lot of parents. We, as a family, for the most part, made a choice not to do sleepovers, with a few exceptions. I often said that not much good happens after midnight at sleepovers anyway, and so if my kids were invited to a party, we'd say, well, you can stay as late as you want, we'll pick you up, but we're not doing a sleepover. Why? Well, probably the dangers of being a counselor. I've spent way too many hours hearing of things that do happen at sleepovers, and even when I think I know a family well, what I don't know is the friends of their friends who come over. What you don't know is what happens when the parents go to bed and kids are left alone with their devices and electronics. And unfortunately, way too many kids are exposed to inappropriate content, especially when there are no parents supervising at the time.
Yeah. What are, I know it's a hot topic, and there's Christian liberty and freedom for how to think through things like sleepovers, but do you have a wisdom principle or a rule of thumb that you would offer out to parents? Like, here's a good way to approach sleepovers for your family.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk about that for a good half an hour. What are the principles? Well, the principles are I want my children to be in relationship with people, but I also know that I have to be thoughtful and proactive and protective. And every family has very different rules and things they're comfortable with, even the shows that they allow their kids to watch. So let's say you're not worried about a child being abused, but with all technology, I mean, kids play different video games that parents have different thresholds for. They have different rules about sleepovers and who they're comfortable with. And the friends of friends who come over. So you have this layering effect that parents don't often think through, that I can know a family really well and know they have wonderful intentions, but they're a little more liberal in how they let their kids use their technology. Or there are friends who come over and spend the night that I didn't know were going to spend the night. And so you have to ask a ton of questions. And I still think it's probably not worth the risk anymore. That you can have a lot of healthy relationships without doing sleepovers. And the potential risk of what happens at sleepovers is a lot higher. So parents could think, well, I can navigate. I asked all the right questions. I made sure they knew what our standard was for what ratings were allowed for TV or for video games. Or I asked, where do the electronics go at night? And those might be reasons that you're okay with it. But you just never know.
Yeah. So sleepovers are one hot spot that I think a lot of people are thinking through of potential danger for sexual abuse, getting exposed to pornography, like you said, just not great things happening. What are some of those other hot spots of danger that parents need to be particularly wisely thinking through and being proactively and setting up rules for their family?
Technology would be a huge one, right? Like we are, I use the language of swimming in a current that is just too strong for our kids today. Because we think we can put on good protective measures, but I've learned as a counselor that kids learn how to get around those parental controls all the time. And when they're not intentionally doing that, their peers are teaching them. So way too often, peers are saying, hey, let me show you an app on my phone. So kids who don't even have technology are being exposed to difficult content just by peers who have a phone sitting next to them on the bus or next to them in the lunchroom. So the way you think about technology, the way you think about stewardship and teaching your kids stewardship principles with technology is really important. But even after you do all those things, are we as Christian parents asking the hard questions to say, am I giving my child a device that opens up a world to them that they're ill-equipped to handle? And it's kind of like handing children the keys to a car at 12 years old and saying, well, everybody else is letting their kids drive at 10 and 12. I guess I'll let you drive too. And we're not stopping and evaluating the wisdom of doing that. So again, people ask a lot of questions like, when should a child have a cell phone? When should we let them have a device? And that leaves out the wisdom of knowing your own kids and their strengths and weaknesses and their temptations. And even just asking the question, no matter how responsible my child is, am I putting something in front of them that's just addictive in nature and it's going to be hard for them to navigate because they're not mature enough to do that yet.
Mm. So good. So thinking about a lot of this proactive stuff, the situation happens, maybe you've even done all this preemptive work, but the situation has happened where there has been sexual abuse or exposure to pornography. What does a parent do now? How do they respond to that initial either finding out themselves or their child coming and telling them?
Yeah. Well, the best is when a child comes and tells you, right? Because it means you've developed a relationship where they feel they can approach you. And it's always important, as impossible as it feels, to be as calm as possible. Meaning I don't want my child to be afraid to talk to me. And so I want to encourage them and just praise them for talking about it, for those who come and tell you. And then I want to help them think through how to handle it. What's the next step? So, for example, when a child's been sent a nude photo, so kids aren't even pursuing it themselves. Lots of kids will just have a photo sent to them and then what to do with it. And parents even knowing to say, you know, at the moment you get a photo like that, delete it. You should delete it immediately. Why? Because if you ever get caught with a photo of another child, even a child your age on it, it's in most states considered child porn and you can get in trouble for it. So though my son didn't ask for it, it was unwanted, but it shows up on his phone. Most parents aren't having those conversations because they just think, my child knows better. They wouldn't do that. Right. But I can tell you as a counselor who works with families that kids are doing it all the time. And even good Christian kids from Christian families who are saying to me, Julie, everybody does it. It's like normal, like drinking water in our school. So parents have this mentality, my son or daughter know better, they never do it. And these teens they're being thrown into a current where it's what everybody's doing. And so to not even have the conversation is leaving them to drown, to be swept away by the current. And even parents who are having that conversation, the current feels so strong sometimes, which is why I can't emphasize enough that it is happening. Because if we don't believe that, parents will never proactively have these kind of conversations.
Mm. Yeah. So let's talk about, okay, sexual abuse has happened, something that the child did not want. There's different angles on what that can look like, but how does a parent respond to sexual abuse particularly?
Yeah. Again, affirm your love for your child, affirm that you're glad that it was found out, no matter how it was found out. Tell them you're not angry at them and say, we've got to do something, we've got to go tell somebody. And so immediately it will need to be reported to the authorities. You don't ever want to take matters into your own hands.
And on that, why report it to the authorities? Just to spell that out for people.
Yeah, well, a couple reasons. One, it's where you're legally mandated to. And secondly, it's because it's not just a legal mandate, it's also our moral mandate to handle it appropriately, to bring it to light, to make sure it doesn't happen. If it's happened to your child, it's probably happened to many, many more children. I mean, the statistics are staggering that by the time somebody gets caught who's abused, they've usually abused more than 100 kids beforehand. And so it is very rare that somebody who has sexually abused a child gets caught the very first time. But yet most kids, most teens, most even adults who eventually disclose say, I just assumed I was the only one, where the reality is they weren't. And so sometimes it's really hard to convince somebody that they need to say something, but if you help them understand it's probably happening to other children, it helps motivate to say, we've got to stop. stop this from happening. And we've got to get help and intervention.
So there's the legal side of reporting it. You're talking about getting help and intervention. What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, depending on the situation, it could be different, but definitely counseling is probably going to be needed. Sometimes the parents need counseling just as much as their child because they're so devastated that it happened to their son or daughter, that it happened on their watch, that they didn't recognize the signs or didn't notice it. And so even just how devastating and hard it could be for a parent, and the son or daughter needing help to process how to think about it, how to proactively work through it. The situations can vary so much. A lot of times there's a rippling effect when it happens in a church or a ministry or a school, and there's many families involved. And so intervention could mean that it could potentially divide a community of people, sometimes an extended family when it happens within families, sometimes in a ministry or church context. So it just has this rippling effect of people who need to be wise and help people walk through how to handle it well.
Yeah. Something on sexual abuse is, it seems like often it's the people that you would expect least.
Yes.
Why is that? And can you help explain why that might make people even more reticent to open up about having sexual abuse happen?
Yeah, I mean, again, statistics show 90% of the time it's somebody that a person knows and is even close to. 90%. That means 10% of the time it's somebody you don't know. So think of the idea of stranger danger, which is a complete myth. Strangers, we always said to our kids, strangers aren't dangerous. Dangerous people are dangerous. Brilliant, I know, right? But I go on to say, how do you know somebody's dangerous? You watch their words and actions. You evaluate them. Dangerous people can be people you know, and dangerous people can be people you don't know. But it's not strangers that are dangerous. It's people with devious actions and words. So what people want, what we want as parents is we want a formula. If I do these 5 things, my kids will be safe. If I teach them strangers are dangerous, if I don't let them have a phone, or if I do this, instead of saying, our kids live in a dangerous world. My job is to equip them to know how to navigate it and walk with the Lord in doing that, to know good from evil, which means I got to teach them what makes somebody dangerous. And the irony with stranger danger is if my children get lost, their very ability to approach a stranger is going to be what rescues them. And so teaching them who to approach. So for example, we told our kids, if you ever get lost, go find another mom with kids. Why? Because statistically, my child picking a pedophile to go to are far worse than waiting for somebody to approach my child when they're lost. My child's there lost crying. Do I really want to wait for somebody to approach them? Or would I rather my child to know who to go to? So statistically, the chances of my child picking somebody who will harm them is lower. If I say go find a woman, it's not politically correct, but statistically correct, it'll be a lower chance. And if I say go find a mom with kids, I'm pretty sure that mom is not going to leave my child until they know they're safe and sound, because that maternal mama bear instinct comes out. Now you could say go find a woman, go find a dad with kids, you could say lots of different things. But we used to say, if you're ever lost, guys, go find a mom with kids.
That's great.
And then we would always let our kids debate it out with us because we wanted to develop in them the skill of critical thinking. So one of my boys was notorious for doing this, and he'd say, well, what if there are no moms with kids around? Like, well, where am I going to take you where there's no other moms with kids? But, okay, let's think about that. If there's no other moms with kids, who could you go to? Maybe a woman? I'm like, yeah, go find a woman. What if there's no women there? Well, then go find a dad with kids. Well, what if there's no dads with kids? Well, then you're on a completely different planet than me. I don't know where you are. But the good thing about that is they're learning the skill of what am I going to do? And that critical thinking skill is a great thing. So it used to be in years past, we'd say, go find a police officer. But the reality is, when is my kid really going to find a police officer in the moment? And for younger kids, anybody in a uniform looks like a police officer, and that could be a janitor at the mall. So again, some of the ways we used to teach kids to handle being lost wasn't really helpful, and it never taught them to evaluate the people what they were asking of them or what they were saying or doing.
I hugely appreciate these different examples and scripts that you've used with your kids that you're giving to listeners. Can you walk us through why role playing, like what you're just describing, is so important in being preemptive and then even walking, if something has happened, helping them process it?
Yeah. Yeah. Role playing is so, so important. I can't emphasize that enough. One of my sons used to say, practice makes permanent, meaning it's not just practice makes perfect, but practice means they learn permanent skills of doing things. But think for a minute, if I am raising my children in a safe environment, is my child ever really going to see somebody as a potential pedophile or sex offender? No, because innocent kids grow up in happy, healthy homes, aren't looking for danger. They don't really believe danger exists. So although I'm equipping them all the time, here's what you do if you get lost. Everywhere we go, if we went to an amusement park, if we went to a state park, if we went someplace new, we'd say, okay guys, before we get out of the car, what's my phone number? They'd all say the phone number in unison. And I say, okay, where are we going to meet if we get lost? And we'd pick a place we're going to meet. Well, who do you go to? And they'd be in the back groaning, a mom with kids, like, Mom, you've done this 100 times. You're right. But kids, when they are in a panicky moment, especially one like being lost, often freeze. We do this when we're in awkward situations, that we freeze in a moment we don't know what to do. And if I haven't practiced, practice makes permanent. If I practice over and over again, though they may freeze in a brief moment, the reality is it'll come back to them because they've spent time after time practicing. So my kids would roll their eyes at some point when I'd make them do the spiel again. But we had this great example where we were a family that proactively did this all the time. We took our kids to an amusement park, and this very scenario unfolded. So I was in a hotel with our youngest, and my husband had 4 of the older kids, and they wanted to stay later at the park. And you know, you're at an amusement park, and there are lights and noises and music, and it's loud. And 2 kids went on this ride, 2 went on the other, or 1 went on the other. Then some decided to jump off this ride to go join their brother, but then they got lost because they couldn't find the entrance to the ride. So my husband's in the middle waiting for all the kids to come out, and 1 comes off this ride, 1 comes off this ride, and 2 are missing. And where did he happen to find the kids? Not with a mom with children, not with a parent, but with a bunch of teenagers. So when he eventually found them, there they were talking to a bunch of teenagers trying to figure out where to go. It became this humorous story because here, that is the worst possible group I'd want my children to go to if they needed help. I would never say, go find teenagers for help. Yeah. But in a panicky moment in an amusement park, they went to the first group they saw who looked big and older than them. And that's what kids do. Even kids that have been practiced and trained, because in a moment of panic, everything goes out the window. Unless you're going to consistently. So the idea of role playing is to say that healthy, innocent kids don't presume these bad things are going to happen. They're often ill-equipped for them. But if I'm practicing regularly, it's going to come back to memory. They're going to remember what to do. They'll stop each other and say, here's where we need to meet, or here's my mom and dad's phone number. So that role playing, teaching them to be independent, making them not afraid of strangers. So even in banks or restaurants or in a grocery store, having my child go up and ask a question of one of the workers is really an important safety skill because they're learning to approach people with the right kind of questions and conversations.
So an example like that, would you instruct your kids like, hey, let's practice this, you go ask this question to them?
Yeah. All the time we would say, all right, buddy, you need to go. And that's why we would have our children even order at restaurants. They needed to learn the skill of being able to communicate. And you always have some shy kids, some kids who will talk to anybody and everybody. And then you have kids that are really shy, but their ability to be able to communicate well. And so sometimes I would say to my son, who was younger, buddy, I want you to go up and ask the worker at Target a question. He goes, no, don't make me do that, Mom. No, really, you need to go just go ask, where do I find this? Why? Because I wanted him to not be afraid of asking for help or directions when needed. That's an important skill. And while they're doing it in front of us and we can help them navigate it, is key
That's so good. I briefly want to talk, before moving on to the next kind of set of questions, about, all right, your child has had sexual abuse in the past now, and they're really struggling with fear, with how to interact with adults, with people they don't know, or even with people they do know that they're close with. How would you counsel parents to help that child that's really struggling with the fear and the anxiety?
Yeah. Well, what's so hard about that is they've now experienced the brokenness of the world, right? And so their eyes are open, they're aware, and the painful reality of that. And that goes to this equipping mentality as well, to say, but the more I educate them to say, you're going to recognize signs now, or here, when people ask you to do this, here's what you should do. Or when people hug you or are affectionate with you and it starts to make you uncomfortable, don't hesitate telling an adult. Teaching children the ability to defy authority is equally as important to teach them to obey, right? So think about that for a minute. I, as a parent, have rarely had to teach my children to disobey me. So I spend all my time teaching children to comply and to obey authority. But a hugely important, not just safety skill, but I think a wisdom issue is teaching children when it's good and right to defy authority. So think of the world where our kids are growing up in, where they call evil good and good evil. They need to learn to be able to stand up and say, no, you're wrong, to a college professor or high school teacher. But likewise, if I'm teaching them to defy authority, when an adult does something to make them uncomfortable, it's too affectionate, says inappropriate things, wants them to look at something that's unhealthy, my children's ability to say no is going to be crucial. So anyway, all that to say, even when a child's had something unhealthy happen, I can still equip them. I can still train them. I can still prepare them to say, you'll know next time. And here's the things you look for. You don't have to be afraid of everything, because here's what you know to look for now. And those conversations are so important.
What resources would you recommend, both for parents and for the one who has, like whether it's the child or a little bit older, experienced sexual abuse? What resources would you recommend to them to dive deeper into this?
Yeah. Well, having somebody who walks alongside them is really, really helpful, because every situation can be a little different. There's great books out there for children now. There's books out there for parents and resources, but having somebody who helps you walk alongside the uniqueness of your situation is going to be really helpful. A trained professional or counselor, a pastor, people in the church who just know how to work well with these situations, videos or stories, anything that can help a family know how to navigate walking through it together.
That's good. I'd love to talk now about common parenting aphorisms. You mentioned stranger danger is an example of that. And I think phrases like that have a way of sticking in our minds and subtly being actually really important in how we parent. And I think for kids too, it sticks in their minds. So can you talk to me about what are some common parenting aphorisms like stranger danger that are not helpful that you hear, and maybe some ones that are helpful that you would encourage parents, like, hey, this is a helpful little tool that you can use with your kids to have truth sink into their hearts?
Yeah, I'll have to think about that for a minute. Probably the one that stands out, because we were just talking about sexual abuse, is right now the new language out there is never make your child hug or kiss a relative. Never make them have to show affection, because you're setting them up for abuse or grooming. Again, I'd argue that's a formula. We create a formula so that we feel good about it, where the reality is that doesn't teach them to discern. It doesn't teach them to evaluate what's going on. So I give the example of I make my kids uncomfortable all the time by making them brush their teeth and do their homework and have to take a shower when they don't want to, right? So the standard's not don't make my child do something uncomfortable. The standard is teach my kids to evaluate what makes them uncomfortable. So if you don't want to hug grandma because grandma smells like mothballs, well, love moves towards people. I think maybe you should be okay hugging grandma. Now, if you don't want to hug grandma because grandma holds you funny or grandma makes you feel funny when she rubs your back, that's important to know, and you don't have to hug grandma. But you see how we're now teaching the child to evaluate what's happening instead of just coming up with a black and white statement? because those statements never keep our kids safe. Wisdom keeps them safe.
Can you think of any ones off that are, here's some helpful ones? I think you've shared some along the way, but any ones that kind of stand out, like that's a really helpful phrase to use with your kids?
Yeah. Well, even let's evaluate. What doesn't make you comfortable? What are they saying and doing? So instead of, again, stranger danger is that great one, because you think of a stranger as being straggly, looking homeless, smelling funny, missing teeth, right? But somebody who's clean cut, shaven, who's smiling, who's polite to you, they're not dangerous at all. And again, we try to evaluate character based on appearance instead of saying, listen to what they say and do. So I would often say that to my kids. Well, what are they saying and doing? Listen to what they're saying or doing. Evaluate that. I use short phrases all the times with my kids, like, are you building up or tearing down? Is what they did building up or tearing down? So when they're like, well, my friend just has a sarcastic sense of humor, I say, okay, well, does the sarcasm build up or tear down? That's Ephesians 4:29, right? Encourage one another, build each other up. So that simple phrase of building up or tearing down, and my son will say, well, we just laughed. Yes, but was your laugh building up or tearing down? And so at some point, you're putting in their lap, well, what's happening? And parents are really good at lecturing kids instead of putting it in their lap and asking them to evaluate. And so I'll often turn it back on my kids and say, well, what do you think? Well, why do you think that? There's really only two ways to live life, your way or God's way. Which way is happening right now? And so short, pithy things like that teach our kids to evaluate rather than us giving them the answers, but having them have to stop and think are so important for them.
That's so good. So we've talked a lot about parenting, and particularly in the realm of sexuality for the younger ages. I'd love to talk now a little bit about the teen years as they're moving into more independence, also into more romantic relationships, and just how parents can wisely be guiding and shepherding their children as they step into this challenging season. So how can parents prepare their younger kids to navigate relationships and think about dating well, especially as they're getting into 14, 15, 16, 18 kind of year-old ages?
Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's so great when parents start talking about it when kids are little and young, and parents that take their kids out on dates and they're modeling how to be treated is great. My sons were mortified because when they got to be probably older elementary, I started saying, all right, guys, you're going to be taking me out for a date or your sister out for a date. They'd be like, oh, that's gross. I don't want to do that. I'm like, nope, you're going to do it. We're going to teach you how to do it. And we would come up with kind of a checklist. And again, there's no right way to do this, but I'd say you need to come up with 3 good questions you're going to ask your date. You need to, here's what being polite looks like. Here's how you treat them. And so we'd walk through that. And so my boys will still tell stories about that. And I'll still say, well, I think you're about due for taking me out on a date. Haven't done that for a while. Why? Because it normalizes. Here's how you treat somebody. Here's how you act. And kids are just growing up not knowing how to have conversations, by the way. I mean, we go to restaurants with our kids and say, can you find a table at this restaurant where nobody's on a cell phone? And this is what good, healthy relationships look like. You talk to them. You ask them questions about yourselves. So think if you're starting young, which we would do around the dining room table, and when we would have company, I would warn the company ahead of time and say, by the way, we always make our kids ask the company questions. I cannot vouch for what kind of ridiculous question it might be, so forgive me ahead of time. But you're helping our children learn how to have conversations with adults and with each other. And so they would ask silly questions like, what's your favorite superhero? Or what's your favorite food? But it was a young child's way of growing and learning to take interest in somebody else. So fast forward, if you're doing that at 6 and 7 and 10, are you going to have a 15-year-old who's more likely to be able to engage well with the opposite sex? Yeah, I would hope so. But it speaks to why that role playing and that practice is so important. And you're teaching them just to have conversations with different age groups, people who are different than them, and you're fostering a care and an empathy in other people. Then on top of it, now you add the stuff like, well, what are our beliefs about dating? what is healthy attraction to the opposite sex look like, and how do you express that, and what's too far in showing affection if you're dating, and having all those really important questions that can't wait until they hit puberty. You should really be, it's that ongoing conversation. And we love that, especially with our younger son, where he would be 10 years old and he'd be looking at his older brothers and go, well, Mom, how do I ask a girl out? If I like a girl, how does she know I like her? And we'd be having those kind of fun conversations with them, which is really good at that age that he's thinking about that.
What are some of those parameters to help parents with the dating age? Because I think there's a diversity of opinions on when it's wise to let your kids start dating and when it's not. There's a huge disparity within good, well-meaning believers, yes, on how to think through dating. What are some of the broader wisdom principles that you would encourage parents to have?
Well, yeah, as you can hear, I'm all about not certain ages and certain rules, but do you really know your own kids, their strengths and weaknesses, and their temptations, and their struggles, and how mature they are, immature? And, you know, there are some kids that might be mature enough to have a healthy relationship, and there'll be other kids who are 17, 18 who aren't showing any maturity in their relationships. And the wisdom of a parent says, I'm looking at my child and seeing where they need to grow. And is it healthier for them to have interactions in a group setting, or to wait? Or, you know, our boys on their own got to the place of saying, well, why would I date anybody in high school? It's not like I'm going to marry them. Or I've got a seventh grader who girls will come up to him all the time saying, why aren't you dating anybody? And he's like, why would I date anybody? You're too much work. And we would joke and laugh, but we say, yeah, that's really true. Like right now in seventh grade, you should just know how to talk to a girl and how to have a good friendship and know a respectful way of communicating and what's not respectful. And we're encouraging relationship all the time. We're encouraging, of course you're going to like girls. Of course you'll have interests. That's totally normal. And so we're normalizing things. We're inviting the conversation. We're saying, hey, what girls like you these days? And or do you like any girls? And so we're not dissuading them from how God created them, but we're always shepherding them and kind of navigating the direction they're going.
The teen years are like notorious for them not wanting to share some of that information that you're just asking. How would you encourage parents to press in when they're asking some of those probing questions you're offering? And they're kind of just getting a stone wall, or the child's really not offering much up, or the teen. How does a parent get into the head of their 16-year-old who doesn't want to share?
Yeah, we give up way too easily as parents. I'll say that. So parents will say all the time, well, I don't know, or I don't want to talk about it. And I'll say, well, you're giving up way too soon. Because if you get, I don't know, I mean, we would say in our home, I don't know is not an answer. I can sit and wait. And then I wait them out, and they'd be like, that's uncomfortable, Mom, I don't know. I said, well, take a minute. I have all the time in the world. The problem is most parents don't. They'll just accept that and move on, or they'll say, well, my child doesn't want to talk to me. What am I going to do? They're a teenager. And I'll say, you're going to pursue them, because that's what love does. Love pursues. Love moves towards. Love enters in. And then I think there's winsome things you can do, like if I ask my seventh grader, what girls do you like these days? He might not want to tell me, but if I say, hey, what kind of girls, how do girls act in seventh grade these days? Well, all of a sudden he's talking a mile a minute about what the girls are doing, or girls are putting notes in the boys' lockers, asking if they like them, check yes or no, and he's telling me all this stuff. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Well, have any girls ever put notes in your locker? He goes, oh yeah, all the time. Really? Well, what do you do with them? I just throw them away. Oh, really? Well, have you ever been interested in anybody? And see, what I did is I got sneaky and I started talking about his peer group. Tell me what boys are talking about these days. So though our kids may sometimes, as they get to be puberty or teen years, might be hesitant to tell you about themselves, they'll often talk about their peers. And then you slowly work your way in, because what you realize is what they're hearing from their peers, they're experiencing personally. And so if I say, hey, our 10th graders, you know any 10th graders who are vaping these days? Or do you know any 10th graders who are sending nude photos to each other? My kids would go, oh yeah, we hear about that all the time. Really? well, what's that like? Like, what's going on? And then they'll tell you, and I'll say, huh, have any of your friends talked to you about that? Have any of your friends offered to send you one? How did you feel about that? So you see how you slowly work your way in, but you start where they're going to be comfortable starting.
That's so good. Can you share how the church Christian community can be so helpful in parenting, especially in the older ages, and practically why that is helpful?
Well, I think the church at large, just talking about things openly, developing a culture of openness in the church, just like I talk about in the home. In the home, I want to develop a culture of openness, that no topic's off limits. We can talk about suicide, we can talk about sex, we can talk about pornography, we can talk about drugs. Like, it's a normal, I as an authority figure have to normalize hard topics. So in the church, that would be true too, right? A church normalizes, or the leadership normalizes, we can talk about these things in youth group. We can talk about these things from the pulpit. We can talk about these things in small groups and home fellowships. And then we're equipping parents to say, you're not alone. Like, other people are struggling with their kids getting involved in these things, or other struggles, other parents are having struggles with mental health issues with their children. That the more we create a culture of transparency, then the more we create a culture of helping each other out and banding together even on some of the ways we want to help raise our kids.
So good. We've talked about quite a few different topics, some very heavy. The last question I ask will be, can you leave parents or whoever's listening with a word of hope? And yeah, how would you encourage people who are listening to this? They're feeling just heavy with all these different angles of dangers that they have to parent and shepherd their children with. What hope would you give them?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a funny story and why I think it leads to hope. We have something in our family called forced family fun. And I'll say, come on, guys, forced family fun. Why? Because we have 5 children, sometimes more at any given time in our home. And inevitably, whatever brilliant idea I have to bond everybody together fails royally, or somebody is not happy. Nope, somebody doesn't want to do it. Somebody's in a grumpy mood and they don't want to go for a hike or play a board game or whatever it might be. And I'll say, oh, too bad, forced family fun. See, the principle is most parents give up. They're like, well, what am I going to do? They hate spending time with us. And I'll say, drag them along anyway. Why? Because you want to build a relationship. I always want to be building bridges with my kids. And so they might have a bad attitude, but my hope is if I force them to go along and do it anyway, that I can win them over to having fun. And more often than not, that is true, but you sometimes have to endure a really bad attitude, a lot of complaining, a lot of arguing. And so, during COVID, we would take our guys on hikes, and we'd say, come on, guys, we're going on a hike, and 2 or 3 would be grumbling. I go, nope, forced family fun, get in, we're going. Like, no nonsense. And those same kids that were mad and grumbling that they had to go were the ones throwing each other in the river and throwing sticks at each other and laughing and having fun. We would play a board game, and we have a son who notoriously hates playing the board games with us, but other kids who love it. And so we'd make him sit down and play it. And I have this very distinct memory of watching my one child who hates the board game and my husband on 2 opposite ends of the table crying hysterically. They were laughing so hard about the game. And I remember sitting there thinking, you stinker. You made this miserable, and here you are laughing, having a great time. But that's our job as a parent, to not let our kids wear us down, but that actually I'm wearing them down and convincing them, I love you. And so even though you're grumpy and miserable, I still want you to come along. And then it's my job to do everything I can to build a relationship with them. And so we joke, we say forced family fun, because it doesn't matter how old your kids are. It doesn't matter if you feel like, hey, I've heard all this and I haven't done any of this, and my kids are 16 or 17 or 13. I'll say, Galatians 6 says, don't grow weary in doing good. Like, it's never too late. You're always planting seeds. You're always building bridges. And so whether you start at 6 or 16, it may be a little harder, but it's never too late. So pursue your kids. Don't give up. Don't let their attitudes be the reason that you stop loving them well.
That's so good. I want to encourage anyone listening to this to go read your book, Safeguards, any of your other books, but particularly appreciate Safeguards. Julie, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and sharing all this wisdom.
My pleasure.
This conversation was made possible by Into the Light's generous donors. Our vision is to see a generation of Christians who delight in God's good design for sexuality and are equipped to face sexual sin. You can join our team of supporters by going to intothelightministries.ca. Thanks for listening.